Well, I hope you've enjoyed your Indian cuisine. Thank you to the cooks. Thank you for the chefs, I should say. Thank you for being here and enjoying that with us tonight. So Kay West, who organizes the meals every month, she has a little bit of an announcement before we get to our presenter. So I'll bring the microphone over to her.
Yes, we're not going to have a food demonstration tonight, but I do want to just mention that there's a couple things on your recipes that you might want to take note of. If you're making the Indian rice recipe, we learned this the hard way, so it doesn't seem like it should have less water than it calls for. I mean, the Indian rice, the Indian basmati rice recipe, we thought that it did not have enough water in the recipe. But if you make it according to the recipe, it should be enough. And you make this in a skillet. Yes, we reduced the water a little bit. We had to make 3 different batches of the rice. The first rice, we put too much water. We thought, that's not enough water. So we put too much water, and it cooks too fast. It gets tender too fast. So you don't need as much water. Indian rice is much drier than other rices when it's done, and you want it to be dry and nice and fluffy, but you don't want it to get too soft. So if you cook it in a skillet, it cooks very fast, and you just really don't have to put as much water as you think you do. Now, the poppadoms, the way we crisp them up, you don't have a recipe for that? But we put these, you get these in a package at the Indian market. That's where I bought them. And that's over on Downtown West Boulevard in Knoxville, right off of Kingston Pike at near Westtown Mall. And you just stick them in the microwave for about 40 seconds. Everybody's got to go and see which one it is. You stick them in the microwave for about 40 seconds, and they crisp up, and they get these little bubbles in them, and that's what you want. If you leave them too long, they'll get really brown, and they taste kind of toasty. But you do want to cook them. And as you're buying them, they have a big selection. They have some that are hotter than others, and I tried to make this as mild as I could because I know a lot of people don't eat a lot of spices. If you've never eaten Indian food and you don't like things very hot, you need to tell the waiter that you want very mild because you will get hot. And it depends on, I've asked for mild before, and that my husband and I, we couldn't even eat it. It was so hot. But if you find a good Indian restaurant, they make some delicious food. So basically, I just wanted to just let you know that regardless of what cuisine you are eating or you follow, you can make it vegan and you can make it healthy. And that's what we've tried to do this season. We've gone to France, we've gone to South America, we've gone to India, we've Japan and Korea. We've just been all around the world this time with the cuisine. So I hope you've enjoyed it.
International.
And also, the International Food Fest is taking place right here in this very room and in the outdoors if weather is good on Sunday, April the 7th from 12 o'clock to 3 p.m. And you will have food from everywhere in the world. And it's going to be delicious, believe me. Some did give out recipes last year, but it's very inexpensive. It's only $1 a ticket. And usually you don't spend more than $6 or $8 maybe, per person. So just remember, keep the date.
Thank you, Kay. So we're going to have a presentation tonight by Dr. Daniel Kim. If you haven't heard Dr. Kim present before, he is a vascular surgeon for Memorial Hospital, and he's going to talk to you about fats and diabetes. Thank you.
Are we good? All right. If we can get our slides up. So the first time I gave this talk was actually at our Reversing Diabetes seminar, and then they asked me to give the same talk here. I guess they thought it was good enough, so this is the second time. Are any of you diabetic? Okay. All right. So this is an interesting topic. The whole reason why I care about diabetes is because as a vascular surgeon, I deal with arterial disease, blockages in arteries all over the body. And I will say that I have 3 types of patients. I have smokers, I have diabetics, and I have diabetic smokers. That's pretty much the vast majority of the patients I see. So if people are not diabetic and are not smokers, the likelihood of them coming to my office is extremely low. All right. Are our slides good? All right. I guess I could tell some jokes if it came down to it. No? All right. Let me think. Yeah. Why are dad jokes so bad? It's because they're apparent. Anyway, I think we're still working on it. I think you had it on PowerPoint, and you just did the PowerPoint play, and that worked. Worst comes to worst, I can just hook up my laptop directly. All right, we're back. So great technology. It always works great when you need it to. So anyway, today's talk is going to be about fats and diabetes. All right, we'll do next slide. Normally the clicker works. It's interesting that if you look in the Bible, this is found in Leviticus, but it talks about how God gives the command not to eat fat throughout your generations. And it's interesting that this command was given like probably about almost 6,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, and that's before people knew about the effects that fat have on our bodies. So it's interesting, these health guidelines are very important. All right, next slide. Today we're going to learn about how fats affect diabetes. We're going to learn to kind of see what fat does in terms of insulin resistance in your body, and if there are better fats versus worse fats, and then what fat does, I guess, in terms of what other nutrients our bodies can use instead of fats. Next slide, please. This is just telling you that if you're going to make drastic changes in your diet, you should probably talk to your doctor, all right? This is informational, but I'm not giving you the prescription for everything. This is stuff that you can, learn about and see the science behind it. And then if you want to make changes, it's always good to consult your doctor because it can affect your medications in terms of how much you need. Next slide, please. All right, how many of you know who this is? Yeah, we all recognize her, right? She's from the South. It's interesting that when I moved to the South, everything had bacon in it and everything was fried, right? And my wife, we lived in Kentucky, and she would go exercising. So she'd go to the gym and she'd get on whatever treadmill and she'd be running. And she'd always watch the Food Network, and she would say, I watched Paula Deen today. She says, that lady really likes butter. She puts butter in everything. And it is kind of true, right? Next. And people like butter so much that you can actually go to a fair now and buy fried butter. They had fried ice cream, they had fried Snickers, fried Oreos. Now you can get a stick of butter that's been deep fried and then you can eat it. The thought of it makes my heart kind of hurt, but. So what's wrong with eating all this fat? Next slide, please. Well, if you think about diabetes type 2, well, there's two types of diabetes as we understand, right? Type 1 diabetes is kind of a genetic thing, you get it from childhood. But I think the vast majority of diabetes, I think it was like 90% is type 2 diabetes, which is a lifestyle disease. That means that it is a disease that occurs because of the way we eat and the way we live. And if it occurs because of the way we eat and the way we live, that means that it is preventable, right? There are certain things that you can't prevent, but there are also things you can prevent. All right, excellent. Now, what you see on this graph is a graph on the top is the incidence of obesity in the United States. That's a map of the US over time. So this is starting in 1994, 2004, 2014. So this is over a 20-year period. And on the bottom, you see the incidence of diabetes. Do you think there's any link between these two things? It's pretty remarkable, right? You can see that the amount of diabetes, the incidence of diabetes has dramatically increased in our society at the same rate as obesity. And if you were to look at 2024, that whole map is probably completely red by now. In fact, when you look at the newer scales, they actually had to change the colors because everything would have been completely red. So what's interesting to me is the fact that our society has become so fixated on, avoiding carbs, avoiding sugar, don't eat this, and yet diabetes continues to increase, right? You can get sugar-free soda all day long, sugar-free drinks, sugar-free candy, whatever it is, yet diabetes continues to climb. So the question is sugar really the problem, or is there something that's more of an issue? Next slide. Now, how do fats affect diabetes? Well, the problem with fat is that when it enters into your body, if you have enough fat, it starts to develop insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is a situation where your body produces insulin, like it's supposed to when you eat sugar or carbohydrates, but your body is not using the insulin, all right? If we can give you an analogy, let's go to the next one, next slide. What it talks about is that if your body keeps producing the insulin and the body is not using the insulin, it's not working properly, then eventually your pancreas, which is the organ that produces insulin, can get tired, right? If you consistently do something and it's not making a change and you keep working at it, you're going to get exhausted, and that's what happens to your pancreas. In many cases of diabetes, the pancreas function, by the time you're diagnosed with diabetes, is down to about 50% of what it can do. It's burned out. Does that make sense? So your pancreas has been working so hard, but the insulin is not working, so your pancreas eventually starts to die from overwork. And that's a bad thing. Now the question is, if your pancreas is already damaged as a result of overwork, can you still live with that? And the answer is yes. If you make lifestyle changes, even with 50% of your pancreas not working, you can still live a pretty normal life. All right, next slide. So in terms of how our body processes nutrients, we think about sugars, carbohydrates, and fats. Now, your body will preferentially use fat. So if you eat a lot of fat, what happens to your body's processing of carbohydrates and sugar? It actually doesn't really do much. And so that's part of the reason why your blood sugar goes up, is because your body is now busy working on the fat, and the glucose, the sugar, gets left behind. If you do reduce your fat content to about 15% of your diet, which is hard for many Americans, then your body starts to process the carbohydrates more effectively. So it's kind of one or the other. So if you don't eat a lot of fat, your body has no problem with carbohydrates. You could eat sugar all day long. I mean, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but you could probably eat a cup full of sugar and your body will get rid of it and process it. But if you eat a lot of fat, then what happens? Your body is now working on the fat, and then the sugar gets left behind, and so your sugar tends to be higher. So that's part of the reason why you don't clear the glucose. They've done these studies in children as well, where they put them on high-fat diets, and then what they'll notice is that they start to develop insulin resistance the more fat they put them on. So this is not a good thing. And so it's a choice between processing carbohydrates and processing fats, and fats are preferentially used. So if you eat a milkshake, that's probably double whammy, right? You got a ton of fat and a ton of sugar. All right, next slide. There's a famous author, his name is Neil Barnard. I always get him confused when I'm telling patients. I'm like, is it Barnard, Neil, or Neil Barnard? It's a problem with having two first names. But he has a book called Reversing Diabetes, and he's done his research, and it's really interesting that he talks about how sugar is not the problem with diabetes and insulin resistance, but he thinks that it's due to fat. And his theory is kind of like this. Next slide. So if you've never read the book, it's really interesting to read. Our cells, so if I eat something really sugary, what happens is my blood sugar goes up, right? My body absorbs the sugar, and then my blood sugar goes up. In response to the increased blood sugar, my pancreas then releases insulin, right? And what insulin is a key that goes into the lock. So I have these cells in my body, and the insulin goes into that lock, and it turns the lock on, which then opens up the cell and absorbs the sugar out of the blood. So it clears the blood, the sugar in the blood, and all that goes into the cell, where the cell then uses it for energy. Does that make sense? So cells are like little machines, they need the sugar. And so the insulin says, hey, there's sugar ready here, and then the insulin goes to the cell opens up, takes the sugar, and then your blood glucose level goes down because now the sugar has gone from your bloodstream into the cells themselves. So that's the usual mechanism. Now the problem with a high-fat diet, according to Dr. Neil Barnard, is the following. You have your lock, you have your key, but now somebody shoved gum in your lock, right? So insulin resistance is that you have the insulin, you've got the cell and the lock, but that's not really working anymore. The insulin's there, but the lock's not working, so your blood glucose, the sugar in your blood, stays high because it's no longer being taken into the cell. Why? Because the cell is full of fat cells, which are now clogging it and preventing it from working. And that's where you get insulin resistance. You have all the components, but they're not working the way they should. And in fact, he talks about studies where when they take people who are on high-fat diets and they put them on a really low-fat diet, that their diabetes gets better, even when they allow them to eat carbohydrates. They say, you can eat whatever you want, rice, pasta, you name it. And most diabetics would say, whoa, I can't do that, it'll spike. But he shows that when the fat level drops dramatically, the body starts processing carbohydrates. And in fact, his claim is that, they have an ADA diet, American Diabetic Association diet. He says that when you go to a super low-fat diet, that the results in terms of your hemoglobin A1C is better than if you follow that American Diabetic Association diet. He says that it actually get better results because you're clearing out the lock. Now, most people say, well, if you're diabetic, stop eating sugar. But that's treating the symptom, it's not treating the cause. And he says the cause is the fat in the cell. Now, when you look at fats, back in the good old days, it was really hard to get oil, right? Oil was very hard to obtain. Even in Bible times, oil was so precious, right? Olive oil you could sell for a lot of money. Now, but before that, what did people do? Most fat came from animal products, right? You had pigs, so you had lard, you had beef, so then you had, tallow, And so fat came from animal products, and then I guess if you're a whaler, you got whale blubber, and you burn that for fuel and light. But as time came around, we started to produce our own fats. We became very good as a society of extracting oil from plants and other things. I always find it fascinating because if you eat a piece of corn, it doesn't feel oily at all, does it? And yet you can buy corn oil for really cheap. You can get oil out of anything, right? They have rice bran oil, olive oil. I mean, olives don't feel greasy to me, but obviously there's enough oil in it. There's corn oil, soybean, you name it. There's oil from any plant, and how do they get all this oil out? I mean, if I were to take this corn and squeeze it, is any oil going to come out of it? The answer is no, it's not, right? So it's pretty interesting how they get the fats. But they also discovered trans fats. How many of you remember butter, Parquet, back in the 80s? Everyone told you to eat margarine. And then, what is it, 5, 10 years later, they told us, oh, that stuff is killing you. You shouldn't be eating that, you know. We were eating all these trans fats. People were making these artificial fats, and we were told that they were better than eating the animal fats, and then now they, you know, years later, they said that stuff was terrible for your arteries. It causes cancer. You know, some of the research says it causes cancer, it causes heart disease, inflammation. It's interesting how medicine changes their mind every 10 years, and that's why I wouldn't put a lot of faith in anything. You know, I'm in a medical, medical field, but I don't put a whole lot of faith. When all these crazy trends come out, I think to myself, we'll see, because they always change their mind. They say, yeah, that was terrible. You shouldn't have done that. Now you're going to die from whatever disease. Next. So there are trans fats. We know trans fats are bad, and those are found in lots of things like fried foods especially. They give you that nice crispy texture, so sometimes pies used to have it in the crust. Now, the thing with trans fats is people figured out that they're really bad, so they told you to stop eating trans fats, and overall they've been banned for a while. The problem is they can still put trans fats in, they just have to put really small amounts, and then it's counted as not really being in there. Next slide. We all know what this is, right? Now, one of the principles is if the oil substance or grease, whatever you're eating, is a solid at room temperature, is probably not good for your body, all right? Because that's what it is inside your bloodstream, right? So the more solid something is at room temperature, probably the worse it is, the more saturated it is. And we call, you know, this stuff shortening for a reason, because it's shortening your life. And you really shouldn't be using it, you know. Oh, hey, my clicker is working now. All right, I got it. Here we are. Now, how do they make modern vegetable oils? Well, the way they do it is they take the product, whatever it is, and they grind it up, and they use hexane, so it's like a petroleum product. Think about like gasoline, or that's a petroleum product. And they use that to separate the oil, then they kind of separate that, they filter it. So it's a really kind of industrial process. And, you know, the question is whether or not that type of oil is even good for you. Now, there are some better ways to make oil. We call it cold pressed, where they're not going through this whole process of heating it up, mixing with chemicals, and then trying to extract them. So cold pressed is probably a little bit better for you, but that's how they make all these fats. All right. Now, what is the problem with a high-fat diet? As we talked about, it causes insulin resistance, and that insulin resistance means that the blood sugar remains high, and a high blood sugar is really what causes damage. So when I see patients in my office who have severe arterial disease, when their blood sugar is high, they get neuropathy, their nerves start dying, and then their blood vessels, I give this example. You guys have all eaten macaroni? All right, so diabetics, when I see their blood vessels, it's like uncooked macaroni. It's hard. Like a normal blood vessel should be like cooked macaroni, soft and pliable. Diabetics will get uncooked macaroni blood vessels. I mean, their blood vessels are so hard that if you try to clamp it, it like cracks instead of compressing. So that's one of the problems. Now, in terms of eating too much oil, it does cause heart disease. You know, they show, like even in kids as young as 12 years old who are on high-fat diets, basically an American diet, they'll see in their aorta, their main blood vessel, they'll see fatty streaking because the oil, that kind of stuff, sticks to the artery wall and causes inflammation. Things like green leafy vegetables, those are like Teflon for your arteries. They kind of make your arteries smoother and to keep the blood flowing, and things like fats and oils tend to, just like it does in your sink, if you keep pouring grease down your sink, eventually your sink gets clogged. Same thing happens to your arteries. Now, the nice thing about your meal tonight was it's guilt-free. You know, I've eaten Indian food before, and they use heavy cream in everything. I mean, it's pretty unhealthy, and diabetes is very, very high incidence in India. All right, now when you look at the fats, is there good fat versus bad fat? Yeah, that's a debatable, but there are fats that are probably less harmful than other fats. So whole food fats, that's like if you eat an avocado or you eat nuts, that's a whole food fat. The fat came in the food, you didn't add it. And in fact, things like nuts are actually protective. They've shown studies where if you eat walnuts, they actually make your blood vessels cleaner. They raise the good cholesterol and lower the bad cholesterol. So nature has very good products already given to you for curing if you use them in moderation. You don't want to eat a whole lot of nuts. Do you know why? Yeah, they have a lot of calories. You know, when I was a kid, I used to like peanuts, and they would burn like a candle. That's how much fat is in them. So although it's good fat, fat is still fat, and it still is calories, which means that we still can gain weight. So, and then there's cold-pressed fats. There's monounsaturated fats, such as flaxseed, olive oil, canola oil, safflower oil, and peanut oil. And then there's polyunsaturated fats, and then there's saturated fats. We all know saturated fats are bad. In terms of what makes a fat saturated or unsaturated, it has to do with the chain. When you look at the chain of the fat molecule, if every single place on that chain is filled with a hydrogen, atom, or molecule, then that is a saturated fat. Unsaturated fat has a kind of a space in it where nothing is, and so that makes it unsaturated. Let's do a quiz here. Peanut oil comes from what? Peanuts. Okay, you guys are really good at this. Olive oil comes from? All right. Sunflower oil? Corn oil? Soybean oil? What about flaxseed oil? Where does canola oil come from? Yeah, canola plant. That's a made-up name. Do you know that canola is not really a plant? They named it that, but it's not really. So canola oil comes from the rapeseed plant. Now, what was rapeseed used for? Back in World War II, rapeseed was used as an industrial lubricant. It was a good oil for oiling your tanks and other machinery. But it was not used by humans. Why? Because it contains a certain acid in it which is toxic to humans. It's problematic for humans. So when you look at canola, it means Canadian oil low acid. Can is Canada, right? Canadian. OLA is oil low acid. It's not a real plant. They named a plant that, but really this was made by the Canadians. And it used to be heralded as a good fat. They said, look, this is a unsaturated fat. It's healthy. You should fry everything in it. And I remember I used to buy Cape Cod potato chips, salt and vinegar, and they would say, canola oil. And Consumer Reports said canola oil is good. So I was like, this is the best fat to be eating. Well, the research now shows that it's probably not the best thing. It's actually genetically modified in the sense they bred the plant till it produced very little of that toxic, acid. But there is still some in there, right? But the bigger thing is that when they did studies on canola oil, they link it to memory loss, like worsening Alzheimer's. So not all oils are created equal, and the fact that even though they touted this as a very healthy oil that we should be frying things in and enjoying, when you look at some of the research nowadays, it seems like this is not really a healthy thing. In fact, what's interesting, they did a study on mice, and so they had mice that had the Alzheimer's gene, and they gave them some canola oil, and the others they didn't give it to it. And the mice that had the canola oil, they had the plaques that are associated with Alzheimer's, more of that in the brain, and they had worse memory, meaning problem solving and whatever test they did, they were worse off. And it was the exact opposite of olive oil. They had done the same study on olive oil, and that actually seemed to make the rats do better in terms of their memory and in terms of the plaque in their brains. Canola oil was the opposite. It was negative. And in fact, there were some warnings that you shouldn't be giving canola oil to kids, which means that nobody should probably be eating it. So that is a warning. And this is just a part of it that describes the studies they did on rats. But I know we're not rats, but it is concerning to me that this is, it's an industrial oil that was not really for human consumption, which they bred to be fit for human consumption, but it's probably not the healthiest. All right, in terms of fats, we have polyunsaturated fats, which shows you a list of those. It's fish oil, at least some of the healthier fish. We know that salmon's good, cod, mackerel, those are also polyunsaturated fats. And then you've got, as you go on, you become the saturated fats and then the trans fats. So the problem with saturated fats is they cause inflammation. When they stick to your blood vessel wall, then they cause inflammation at that spot, which then causes damage and then blockages. Same thing like smoking does, same thing with trans fats. So that is a problem. Now, saturated fats are not typically found in plant products, they're mostly found in animal products. And then trans fats are really bad for you, so for the most part, they're no longer in food substances. Anybody remember these chips? Yeah. This is what I'm telling you. Every time they come out with something, they tell you you can have all the enjoyment you want, and you won't have to pay the price. There's always a price to pay. You know, and that's true with sugar-free, right? People drink these giant tubs of sugar-free soda and sweet tea and everything else, and they say, 0 calories is not going to affect me. That actually affects people too. You know, there's studies that show that artificial sugars cause problems with, in terms of weight gain. Even though you have 0 calories in the sugar in the drink itself, it stimulates your appetite. All that sweetness makes you eat more, and so people gain weight. It also fools the body, and sometimes the pancreas actually releases insulin, even though there's no sugar, which then makes you hungrier because your blood sugar then drops. So there's no unintended consequences, you know. And the other thing is even, what's the new medication? Ozempic, right? It's like a miracle drug. Everybody seems to be taking it because they want to lose weight and not have to, you know, exercise and do other things. But there are now research that Ozempic causes paralysis of the stomach. People's stomachs are no longer working, so you have a food bag that doesn't let the food move through, which means that it's just sitting there rotting in your stomach. I mean, this is a problem. So Olestra was a substance they came out with where they said you can have all the crispiness and taste of oil without any oil being absorbed by your body, no fat. And this came out and everybody was running out and buying these chips. The only problem was that because your body could not absorb the oil, where did the oil come out? It came out in your underwear, you know, it came out in your bowels. They had reports of what they called anal leakage because the grease would just go through you, your body could absorb none of it, and then it would just come out the bottom. And the problem with this fat was also that it would absorb the vitamins. There are fat-soluble vitamins that go in fat. And so these fats would take up vitamin A, D, E, and K, and then take the vitamins and go right out into the toilet. So you would lose the vitamins instead of your body absorbing it. There is no free lunch. That's the thing. So this is no longer on the market. But the way they made this fat was they took a fat molecule and they jammed so many fatty chains onto it that your body could no longer get in there and break it down into its pieces and absorb it. So they made a non-absorbable fat, and then they used that to fry things. Unfortunately, it's no longer on the market because it had so many different side effects and bad consequences. Now, if you notice, I like the abbreviation, Standard American Diet, SAD. So that's a SAD diet. But the Standard American Diet is high in fat, low in, you know, whole foods, low in fresh fruits and vegetables. There's a lot of things in there, and it tends to cause inflammation and heart disease. Whereas if you eat a whole food, plant-based diet, you tend to get a lot of fiber, very little fat, because fat is scarce in nature, right? Corn oil, you can get a ton of corn like oil, but if you eat corn itself and look at the fat content, it's minuscule, right? So just about everything other than like avocados and nuts, they have very little fat in nature. Nature naturally gives you very little fat. Now, coconuts have more fat, but overall, everything you'll eat is very low in fat. And they also come with very good things like antioxidants. You never get antioxidants in your hamburger, but you'll get antioxidants in your bell peppers and, you know, different fruits and vegetables. Well, what can you do when you're preparing food? So we understand that fats are problematic. In fact, high fats are really problematic. So how do you reduce that? Well, there are things you can do. You have air frying, although now people are saying, well, high temperature, you know, can cause problem and carcinogenic changes. So is air frying good for you? I guess in moderation and also not using too much oil for it. You can reduce the amount of oil. You can roast things. You can bake things. You know, you can boil things. And you can also do things with less water to keep the flavor. And you can use herbs. There are different flavorings you can put in. Now, there's really no great substitute for the taste of that, like oil on your, like if you eat a French fry, you know that feeling, right? That greasiness. You're not going to get that really from nature. It doesn't come that way. But when you're baking, you can use applesauce, you can use dates, figs, you know, prunes. Those are all healthy things that you can put in, and it'll keep your cake moist without having to use a lot of oil. Now, the China study, if you remember, this was a really big study, and when you look at the study, what's fascinating is that when you look at the risk of diabetes, you'll see that it's inversely proportional to carbohydrates, but it is proportional to the fat content. So what you'll notice is in Japan, they eat tons of carbohydrates, right? But why is the diabetes rate so low? Look at the fat consumption. Fat consumption's minuscule, yet they eat tons of carbs, and yet they're not diabetic. And that tells you that carbohydrates are not really the problem, right? We always blame the carbohydrates because that's where glucose comes from, but that's probably more the symptom than it is the actual problem. And in the United States, we eat a very high-fat diet, and diabetes is very high as well. You know, even with everybody going to these low-carb diets, I'm very concerned that I'm not sure it's a safe thing to do long-term, you know, because if you think about it, your body's primary fuel is glucose, right? Your body runs on glucose. Your muscle cells, your brain cells, everything prefers glucose. And when you go on a low carbohydrate, no carbohydrate diet, you're going into ketoacidosis. You're creating a secondary fuel from the fat and trying to feed that to your body. So, but it is interesting that when you look at the studies, now even in Korea and Asia, there is a lot, I mean, they eat rice at every single meal. I mean, when I was growing up, there was rice, breakfast, lunch, dinner. You know, you ate rice at every single meal, and yet diabetes is pretty low. Why? Because people, traditionally, there wasn't a lot of fat in the diet, and then also people were more active. So the other key to diabetes is inactivity. The more we sit around, the more likely we are to develop insulin resistance. So obesity and sedentary lifestyle are probably the two things that will give you diabetes. All right, so what is our conclusion? You want to eat whole food fats, but in limited quantities. You know, things like avocados are good, but don't chow 4 avocados every meal. It still has a lot of fat in it. It's probably not the healthiest. And, you know, if you're going to eat nuts and seeds, they're healthy. They really are very good for you. Eat them in moderation. They can raise your good cholesterol, I mean your good fat, not cholesterol. You know, the HDL cholesterol will go up, and, but at the same time, it is fat, so the typical recommendation is not more than like a quarter cup a day. You know, I know honey roasted peanuts are really tasty, but don't eat the whole jar. You know, it's not a healthy thing. And, you know, this is, I think Supper Club is a great thing. They give you recipes, they give you, you know, you taste food that's wholesome, flavorful, and really, you know, not full of sugar and fat. And then you want to avoid high-fat foods, and that really means don't eat out. You know, anytime you eat out, that really, it's hard to eat a meal anywhere outside your home that's not chock full of fat. You know, it's either full of fat or sugar or both. But that's the difficulty is we're kind of attuned to really enjoy fat things, you know, like things that are fried, full of fat, sugar, and salt. It makes us happy in a way, but it's really bad for our bodies. So be conscious of that and try to avoid them. Once in a while is probably not going to make a difference. You make it a habit, you may have a problem long term. Any questions? Now, if you guys have never been to the diabetes seminar, if you know anybody who's type 2 diabetic, you know, next time they run it, you really should attend. It's a great seminar. They give you a meal, and it's very informative to learn about it. You know, the lifestyle modification that comes with it. You know, people lose weight during the program, and their diabetes, you know, control gets much better because of the changes they make. Yes?
The Dr. Barnard?
Yeah, Neil Barnard. Mm-hmm.
Is that reversing diabetes? Is this some of the stuff that he recommends, or does he go further?
So if you look at his book, it's very interesting that his whole philosophy, you know, I read probably the first half of the book, was that he believes that fat is a big culprit when it comes to diabetes. So that's one thing that he talks about. The second thing, he includes recipes in his book. And it was interesting because when you look at the recipes that he provides, so he actually gives you recipes in the book, you'll see that the recipes are all extremely low fat, and they're all plant-based. There's no meat recipes in his book. So, and it does work. There was a nurse in my hospital, she was a nursing supervisor, but she told me her husband was diabetic. I said, here, I'll lend you this book, you can read it. He took the book home, so his blood sugar levels were in the 200s in the morning when he would wake up. He started following the book. She said he lost 27 pounds like in a couple of months, and his blood sugar in the morning was under 100 just following that book. And so it made a big difference for him. He started to come off some of his medications, and it made a huge difference. Now, if you go to Amazon, you'll see lots of 5-star reviews, and then you'll see a 1-star review and says, this book tells you to be vegetarian. They give it like 1 star. They complain about it. But the reality of it is if it works, it works. And diabetes is kind of like the modern leprosy. It really is. You know, in the Bible, everyone's so afraid of leprosy because they would lose their body parts, and I see that all the time. It's unfortunate, but many of the amputations, I would say probably most of them are in diabetics. And the reason it happens is, now smokers get blockages in their arteries from their knee up to here. This is where most of the blockages are, in the heart. Diabetics get blockages in a small blood vessel. So when you get below the knee, the main artery divides into 3 small branches. Diabetics get blockages in the small branches, and just like you know, if you have a small pipe that you're unclogging versus a sewer main, a big pipe, you know, that's why your toilet gets clogged before the sewer main outside, right? The smaller the pipe, the easier it clogs. Same thing with arteries. The smaller the artery, the more easily they get clogged. When you unclog them, they clog back up faster. And so the problem with diabetes is like you're taking a tree and you're cutting off all the branches, and then the trunk will die because there's nothing, you know, to feed. Does that answer your question? Yes?
You mentioned how the arteries get all changed by the diabetic process.
Mm-hmm.
And Bernard talks about reversing it. Is it actually possible to reverse the condition of the arteries by lifestyle?
Okay, that's a good question. Now, so the question is, in terms of your arteries, does reversing diabetes or controlling all these things, does it reverse the disease that's within your arteries? Now, in terms of coronary artery disease, they did show some studies that when you come off the high-fat diet, I think it was Dean Ornish, like what would happen is that the plaque in your heart arteries would get less. But in terms of diabetic arterial disease below the knee that I see, it's calcium. What happens is all the inflammation causes calcification. So I don't think the calcification goes away. I would say if you have a fatty plaque or more of a cholesterol plaque, that could be reversed. I mean, there's people, you know, gallbladder disease, right? People get gallbladder attacks, gallstone. They've actually shown that if you cut out the fat in your diet, a lot of times the gallstones will dissolve and go away on their own, right? Because why is bile produced? It's to help dissolve fat. That's why your body, it's like dishwashing liquid for your intestines because it helps to break the fat down. So if you don't eat fat, your body will tend to break it down. But I don't think it'll reverse arterial disease in the small vessels because it's calcified. When you x-ray a diabetic's leg, what you'll see is the bones, and then you'll see what looks like little bones, and it's actually their arteries. Arteries should be invisible under x-ray because they're soft tissue. But diabetics' arteries are so hard that you'll see these lines where the arteries are. And in fact, when I'm poking them with a needle, it feels like I'm scratching something. You know how if you were to scratch a piece of like, you know, concrete or something, that kind of feeling? That's what it feels like. Yes?
I have a friend who's been fighting diabetes for about 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been vegetarian and all that.
Sure.
Just this week, he decided to just really go all the way with cutting out fats.
Yeah.
Even nuts and stuff.
Sure.
For now. And he said 3 days, his sugars went down 60 points.
Yeah.
He says he never felt so good, he's never had such good results. And he's told he's all over Facebook now, like, do this, you gotta do this.
Yeah, and that's what Dr. Neil Bernard's been preaching for the longest time. He says it's not the carbohydrate that's the issue, it's the fat that clogs the cell. He says if you stop eating fat, the cells will clear out, and then your insulin resistance will get better as a result. Yes?
Why do you think that the public has this idea that you can't live without eating meat?
Yeah, you know, that was funny. Somebody today in the office, no, I was in the operating room, we were doing surgery, and one of the nurses, you know, she found out, you know, I don't eat meat. She said, how do you get your protein? I said, beans. Beans have great protein, good fiber, without all the fat, cholesterol, you know, and salt. So, you know, if you look at the biggest land mammals, what are they on planet Earth? You have an elephant, right? They're vegetarian, and they're huge. Do you go to an elephant and say, where'd you get your protein, man? You know, the elephant is full of protein. Now, of course, we can't eat the same things the elephant do, but it tells you that these large animals are able to eat vegetarian products and still have the necessary protein to build. They eat constantly? Well, if you eat grass constantly, you'd be full too. No, it's actually interesting because when you look at volumes of food, that's another thing that's very interesting. The reason why we tend to gain weight is volume of food, right? If you look at a picture of 100 calories of meat, it's like this big. 100 calories of broccoli is 3 heads of broccoli. Which one are you going to be fuller with, right? So that's part of the problem is calorie density. So the more processed the food, the more calorie dense it is, and the more weight we tend to gain because it's a lot of calories in one thing. Like you could eat a whole McDonald's meal and a few hours later you're probably hungry again. You ate fries, burger, soda, and then you're still hungry a few hours later. So, any other questions? These are all interesting thoughts. Yes? Well, yes. Oh, is plant-based butter bad for you? I guess it depends what plant they're using and what type of butter they're making out of it, you know. I mean, the thing is, if it's not saturated fat, it's probably less harmful than eating real butter. You know, there's something called AGE, anti-glycosylation end products. And what it is every item that we eat, whatever it is, whether it's meat or plant or whatever else, has AGEs in it. And what it shows is an inflammation index. If you look it up, look up AGEs, the higher the AGE value of the thing that you're eating, the more likely it is to cause inflammation in your body, which then leads to chronic diseases like kidney disease, heart disease, whatever else. Now, what's interesting is that butter is extremely high on that AGE. The only thing I think that's higher might be bacon. Bacon is super high on that list of things that cause inflammation and disease in the body. Fascinating is that all the plant products are extremely low. Like if you look at the highest I think was avocado. Avocado was a little bit higher, but everything else is extremely low. Even the way you cook it, the food, will make a difference in the type of inflammation. So if you take chicken and you boil it, it has less of these inflammatory products than if you bake it versus frying it versus like grilling, like, you know. So things that are cooked under high heat without moisture tend to have much higher of these AGE products. So as far as the plant butter, there's so many variations of it. I can't tell you. I think you'd have to look at what is it made of, how did they get the oil. Cold press is probably less harmful than taking something. And then obviously hydrogenated oils are not good for us. That's kind of like the whole thing of making them solid. Other questions? Yes?
Can you speak a little about coconut oil?
Coconut oil. Yeah, that's a hot topic, isn't it? You know, back in the 80s, they told you coconut oil was going to kill you. Then about 5 years ago, everyone started eating coconut oil like it's like the best thing in the body. As I told you, I don't trust the medical societies. Every time they tell you something, 10 years later, they tell you, oh yeah, it was really bad for you. I would say everything in moderation. You know, it is a solid oil at room temperature. My wife uses it to make soaps, so I don't eat her soaps, and I don't cook with it. But I would say that it probably has its role, but I'd be careful eating large quantities of it simply because it is a solid. I mean, the goal, I think, is to reduce the fats in our diet as much as possible. Any other questions?
Is it true that the Irish have a high-fat diet and low heart disease?
So the question is it true that the Irish have a high-fat diet and low heart disease? I don't know that. I'm not Irish, and I don't know many Irish people. You'd have to, I don't know. You'd have to look it up. I know that, like, for example, the Mediterranean diet is noted to be pretty good for heart disease. You know, and longest living people in Japan is one of the places. There are areas called blue zones, as you guys are probably aware of, in the world, and those are areas of the world where people live much longer than the average population or populations around them. In the United States, the only area that's a blue zone is Loma Linda, California. There's a large Seventh-day Adventist population there, and the health message, you know, vegetarianism, healthy living, those are kind of big topics, and so they tend to live much longer than the rest of the U.S. on average. So in Japan, they eat a lot of fish, you know, fish products. Once again, not really a high-fat diet. You know, meat is not a big thing. I will say, though, that Asia has been modernized, westernized, and now everything is kind of like it is here, high-fat and fairly unhealthy. So I think you'll start to see trends of diseases similar to what we see in the United States.
Okinawa is one of those.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That's correct.
And one of the components is that they remain very active,
Sure.
gardening, walking, but they're very active, and that apparently is a factor,
Sure.
along with a strong social network and the diet.
Sure.
So all three things appear to be important.
Sure. So the comment was that in Okinawa, they're very active, and then they have a strong social network. I will say the interesting thing about a lot of these blue zones is that they're homogeneous populations, right? In Okinawa, you have a group of Japanese people you know, in Spain, whatever, they have a group. Loma Linda is very heterogeneous, right? There are people from all over, so there's not one, you know, uniform population. So I think lifestyle makes a big difference there. In terms of genetics, there is a role in genetics too, right? We know that when I see patients and they're in their high, you know, high 80s, and they tell me their parents lived 100, I'm like, well, you've got good genes. But there's nature and there is nurture, right? The way we're born with our genes and then the way we live both have impacts. Any other questions? Yes?
Are you seeing any improvement in your practice? I mean, are people waking up?
Are people waking up? Improvement in my practice. I try to get people to come to the diabetes seminar because they're all diabetic. None of them want to do it. That's the difficulty, right? You know, there's so much knowledge and there's so many resources, but the problem is there's inertia. You know, people don't want to change. Change is difficult. You know, I think the fact that you guys are here is a great thing. It means that you want to change. You're open to change. You want to learn. But so many people just want to live their lifestyle. They want you to invent a pill that they can take and they can keep eating what they're eating, keep sitting around and watching TV and doing nothing and get better. You know, that's the American society. We want pills to cure us. And I think that's part of the reason why the focus so much is on sugar, right? Because people see sugar, it's because your blood sugar is high. Well, why is it high? Nobody focuses on the root cause. They all care about the fact that the sugar's high, and they're all treating that. All the time I see patients in my office with swelling, severe swelling in their legs. And most of the time it's because they're eating a ton of salt. You know, they eat a lot of salt. And the way the body works is you eat salt, you absorb water. Where does the water go? It goes downhill and ends up in your legs. I've had patients whose legs were like so swollen. I said, what are you doing? What are you eating? I just ate a Hardee's from a biscuit. I look it up, it's got like 2,000 milligrams of salt. That's your entire day's salt in one biscuit. I said, how many do you eat? You know, and the reality of it is there was one patient, I told him, you gotta stop eating salt. He did. He came back 2 weeks later, had lost 27 pounds of water. Like literally, his legs went from like a tree trunk down to a normal leg just by cutting out salt. Now, what would you do if you go to most doctors? They'll give you a water pill. They say, oh, you're swollen? Here, take a diuretic. That's not the answer. The answer is lifestyle. You gotta modify, you gotta treat the cause, not the symptom. But we're so trained in medicine to treat the symptoms. You have swelling, give you a diuretic. You have high blood pressure, give you a pill. Well, why is your blood pressure high? Get to the root cause, fix the root cause. Why is your blood sugar high? Fix the root cause. You know, if you treat the symptoms, you'll never cure the person. You're just going to be treating symptoms till they die and giving them more and more medication. So lifestyle is the biggest thing, eating well. I always say food is either your disease or it's your cure. It can be one of two things. What you eat can either cure you or it can give you the disease. Yes?
Do you think there's ever going to be a time when medicine will wake up and change from mainly using pharma to
Yeah. There's no money in lifestyle changes. There's no money in lifestyle changes, I think unlikely. You know, everyone's just gonna try to think of a better pill. I think Ozempic is a perfect example. You know, I have young girls in my office. They're younger than me, morbidly obese. They went through surgery, right? They went through a gastric bypass surgery. But I see what they're eating. Every day they're going down to cafeteria and buying all this fried food and eating it. So even after surgery, still gaining weight. Now she's on Ozempic. At some point we have to look at ourselves and say, am I the reason why this is happening? You know, I have to change, not people changing me or a pill changing me. But I think Ozempic down the road is probably gonna have some severe consequences. You know, people wanted a pill that they could lose weight without doing anything differently. It would suppress my appetite. I think there's always a price to pay. There's no easy answer. The hard choice is always the better choice, right? It's easier for me to sit on my butt than to go and walk around the lake or, you know, walk on a greenway. It's easier for me to drive to McDonald's and eat junk food than to prepare a healthy meal at home. The hard choice is always, in 99.9% cases, is the better choice. Any other questions or comments?
Any big pharma needs to launch a program to develop an anti-stupid pill.
So the comment was that pharma needs to get a campaign to make an anti-stupid pill. Well, what is the saying? If you make something idiot-proof, someone will make a better idiot. So,
Anybody that believes in a
Yeah.
foolproof system
Yeah.
seriously
Sure.
underestimates the ingenuity of food.
Oh yeah, it is absolutely true. I think the smarter our devices get, I think the dumber we get. I think really that's the answer is the smarter our devices become, the stupider we become. Because now I don't have to memorize a single phone number. You know, people don't even know their own phone number if you ask them sometimes. But I remember I read a story about these little girls. They somehow fell into a sewer, you know, like in England, and rather than calling 911, they're updating their Facebook page saying, "Help, we're stuck in a sewer, please send somebody." They had their phone, but instead of, you know, calling the cops or fire department, they were updating their profile, you know, their status. "We were stuck, please, somebody come help us." But yeah, that's kind of how we've become. Any other questions or thoughts? Well, sorry for the technical difficulties, but thank you.